Okay, this is part 17, the Synagogue of Satan, Footprints in History. We've been looking at the Crusades before, and to sum up, you might say that those that benefited the most from the Crusades were just a very few, especially the Venetians. They would gain access to the Silk Road to the Far East through ports like Acre, Tyre, Sidon, and especially Constantinople. And not only were the Venetians buying slaves and gold from the Mongols, they were actually coordinating with the leaders of the Mongols for purposes of both Venice and the Papacy, especially the destruction of the cities of Kiev and Budapest. The Mongol armies killed more by disease than by actual battle, and it's been proven almost beyond any shadow of a doubt that the Black Death went hand in hand with the Mongols. They were the source of the disease. Their army was based totally on horses. Horses will devastate the ground by eating the vegetation with the roots, and this would also destroy any agriculture. They had destroyed the agriculture of southern China with their invasions there, and this caused a movement of black rats into southern China. They had been isolated before in northwestern China. The black rats would eat ergot, which is a yeast or mold that grows on grain, and this might have also grown on any devastated vegetation. The black rats brought fleas, which carried the Black Death. The Mongols devastated both Islamic lands and also lands of the Eastern churches, and this all worked well with the purposes of the Papacy to increase their control. The Venetians were continuing to deplete overvalued silver from Europe and sending it into Islamic lands in the Far East, effectively putting them on a silver standard where China had been on a gold standard before. It was naturally rich in gold, and the Italian banks led by Venice would get around the disapproval of usury and put whole countries and kingdoms into debt. They would put conditions on their loans which would require the revenues of the kings of whatever country they were trading in. And this would put whole industries like the wool industry of England and also Spain into debt to the Venetians and the Italian banks. So the Italian banks basically privatized the English crown and monopolized the biggest industry of England, the wool trade. King Edward of England tried to keep the Italian banks from taking their profits outside of his kingdom, but the Italian banks exchanged their profits for wool, and they would store the wool in so-called monasteries of the Knights Hospitaller to keep it from Edward. But if you remember, many Templars had gone underground and hidden within the order of the Hospitallers, so this is just more evidence that the Templars were aiding the Italian banks. By taking high profits and fees for the use of their coinage, the banks and their associated so-called republics were shutting down whole industries and basically bringing trade to a standstill. And as more and more landowners lost their lands to bankruptcy and the banks, they were forced into the cities. Then King Edward III of England began a devastating war in France, which would last long past his own lifetime. The war was over the succession of the French throne and his own claim to the throne of France. He would no doubt borrow heavily from Italian banks to fund the war. The French kings were using money from the Catholic Church and the Papacy, which they were controlling in France at that time. And so it appears that both the Papacy and Venice and the Italian banks were supporting two different sides. Here again, they're playing both sides. So Edward's war in France brought England into greater debt. He had already made other unwise loans with Florence, and he eventually defaulted on the loans to Florence. And this caused a widespread financial crash in the 1340s, bringing down the entire economy of Europe. The Venetians seemed untouched by the crash, and their ships were bringing disease-carrying rats into Sicily and Italy and other ports where the Venetians were trading, and it seems that this was almost on purpose. The rats would bring the Black Death, and the Black Death would spread quickly in the cities, which were swelled with those that had lost their fortunes in the financial crash, and the Black Death would spread over Europe. But the Black Death, which is talked about so much in history, was actually a cover-up for the financial crash. The Black Death had killed much more in the Islamic world and in the Far East than it did in Europe. As the Venetians got more control of trade and industry, they increased a tax on classical education, which had existed as far back as ancient Greece and Rome. They were doing the same thing that Bernard of Clairvaux had done in the Cistercian order. He viciously attacked classical education in the monasteries. This was just a way to keep most from getting any higher learning, and it would force them into the mystery schools or secret societies to get higher education. This appears to be just a Kabbalist maneuver to control access to knowledge, and it's most likely what caused the Papacy to ban classical education in the monasteries. Before that, the monasteries had been places of very high learning. But then monks were only allowed to learn just basic trade knowledge. As battles continued between the kings of England and France, it may be that the English crown supported the election of a second pope in Rome, and this would be in an attempt to cut off the funding that the French kings were receiving from their control of the papacy in France. So at one point there were actually two popes supported by two coalitions, one coalition headed by the kings of France and the other coalition by the kings of England, and all the while they were fighting, there was no one in either England or France to fight the Mongols and Turks in the east. The Black Death allowed Turks and Mongols to advance further in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and the Turks were able to use civil war in Byzantium to get more political control of Constantinople. The Turks also were able to get more control of the Balkans when they took over Serbia at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. There was a backlash in Western Europe against Italian bankers and merchants. They were expelled from Spain and banned from taking profits in England. Genoese bankers were imprisoned and then expelled from Flanders, and all Italian merchants were banned from Paris. Italian merchants and bankers had never been allowed in ports of the Hanseatic League of Northern Europe, but it appears that the Italian banks used the Teutonic Knights to undermine the Hanseatic League. And if you remember, it's believed that many Templars infiltrated the Teutonic Knights when they went underground. So this is just evidence again that the Templars were helping the Italian banks. Some Italian merchants had made it into Poland following the Dominican and Cistercian orders, where they would help the Catholic Church gain influence. In 1408, the Merovingian Dragon Court was formally re-established on mainland Europe by Sigismund von Luxembourg. It was recognized by the Catholic Church ostensibly to fight the Turks. The Dragon Court had remained only in the British Isles up to that time, since the Merovingians had fallen from power. But in 1410, the Teutonic Knights, aka the Templars, suffered a massive defeat at the Battle of Grunwald or Tannenberg in Poland. The Catholic Church lost even more credibility when there were three popes at one time. The division in the papacy allowed for more freedom of thought, especially in Bohemia. It had more access to information because of its wealth and its location midway between East and West. The Hussite movement challenged papal authority and especially condemned its doctrine of transubstantiation and indulgences. The doctrine of transubstantiation basically claimed that Catholic priests had the magic power to turn the bread of the Mass into the actual body of Christ. So it seemed that this really meant that at every Mass, Christ was being sacrificed again. There were many that found this offensive and not Christian. With their greater expertise in Bible translation and interpretation, rabbis would help sustain doctrinal divisions in Bohemia. The Pope, of course, condemned the Hussites as heretics and eventually launched a crusade known as the Hussite Wars, which finally came to an end in 1434. The Pope would use this as an excuse to gain more control in Bohemia, and the Venetians would be able to carry out and loot more silver from Bohemia in the confusion. The King of Bohemia would use the wars to increase his control of Bohemia and beyond. The kings of Bohemia would marry into powerful families like the Habsburgs and Luxembourgs, and these families would end up controlling the office of Holy Roman Emperor through the King of Bohemia. The King of Bohemia was the most important of 7 electors that would supposedly choose the Holy Roman Emperor. 3 of these electors were lay German princes, and 3 electors were ecclesiastical princes of Germany. Curiously, the Habsburg and Luxembourg families would marry into Merovingian families like Guise, Anjou, and Lorraine, and they would also marry into banking families of the northern Italian republics like Medici, Este, Gonzaga, and Sforza. In 1439, Vlad III, better known as Dracula or the Impaler, was inducted into the Order of the Dragon by Sigismund von Luxembourg. In 1453, there were 2 events that may be more connected than it appears at first glance. This was the fall of Byzantium to the Turks and the end of the 100 Years' War between the English and French kings. The Turkish takeover of the city of Constantinople itself wasn't straightforward, as is often portrayed in the history books. The Emperor Emmanuel II of Byzantium actually made alliances with rival Turkish leaders to block a concerted effort to take the city, and the Turkish Sultan Murad actually took over the port of Salonika from the Venetians, which would help Byzantium, but the Sultan Murad died, and the Sultan Mehmet actually made a peace treaty with the Venetians and also the Hungarians, and Sultan Mehmet and the Turkish army would not have been able to take over the city of Constantinople without the help of Italian engineers. So here it seems that we see the Venetians at work again in taking Constantinople. These complicated alliances may explain why many Turks were already serving Byzantium, and also why many of the nobility of Byzantium had actually converted to Islam. A few others of the nobility escaped the Turks when they left Constantinople by ship at about the last minute, but there was a final stand to the death against the Turks, including the last emperor himself, Constantine XI Palaeologus. The Palaeologus dynasty claimed to be descended from the house of David like the Merovingians, and many of the Palaeologus and other noble families of Byzantium were known to be expert sailors, and some of them were already serving rulers of the West like the King of France. I'll continue in the next part with the transformation of the banks and their alliance with certain aristocratic families to dominate Europe and the rest of the world. I'll see you then.